Today we're going to talk about Caulerpa. Caulerpa is a type of macroalgae. It's actually the genus of a lot of different species of macroalgae. I have a reasonable experience of keeping different species of Caulerpa. In this particular tank there's 3 different species. It's also a type of macro that I would recommend to beginners if they're looking to learn how to keep macroalgae. It's one which, although grows extremely fast, will teach you the error of your ways if you don't look out for its needs. Thankfully, macroalgae are becoming more and more popular. I say thankfully because I really enjoy keeping macros and I think it's a benefit to everybody just to give them a try. It's a different frontier of reef keeping. In general, Caulerpas grow extremely fast, which is one of the reasons why they tend to be widely available. Although not all species are available, some of the most common, like this one, which is Caulerpa racemosa, do tend to be available pretty much everywhere. As I just mentioned, they're extremely fast growing, which leads on to some of their main benefits. So with the rise of interest in macro, people are using Caulerpas. Generally, they are the first to go in because they're quite tough. It's pretty difficult to kill a Caulerpa, once it's established at least anyway. This particular one is Caulerpa racemosa. It's a firm favourite amongst people because it has all this frondy look to it. It's very, very pretty. And once established, it's actually really quite difficult to remove from a system. Now, some people will find that unsettling, especially if you have a reef tank. A lot of the time people's aims are actually to remove as much algae from their tank as possible. So sometimes the idea of adding a macroalgae which may in fact take over can be a little bit daunting. That being said, even in this nano tank, it's only 30 litres, this Caulerpa has done really well. I do like twice a month water changes, 100% water changes, so that might explain why it's doing so well. If you're interested into why this algae's gone white, it's because this light is too bright, but that's a different whole video. But in terms of the Caulerpa, you can see its structure. We've got a long stem. I'm going to call them basic names rather than technical names. We've got some roots, and then we've got our leaves or fronds. Now the interesting thing about Caulerpa, unlike most other macroalgae which I keep, Caulerpa is actually just one gigantic cell. Now you might not believe that, but it has the ability to change parts of its structure to meet its different needs. So even though it's got fronds and roots and stems which we might associate to higher plants, it's actually an algae and it's actually just one entire cell, which is absolutely amazing, isn't it? If we talk about the pros of adding Caulerpa to your system, firstly I would say is the variety of shapes that it can add to your reef tank. Now I do appreciate a lot of people don't like something that looks as messy and as disorganised as this. I do, because I think it looks kind of wild and that's just the aesthetic I like. But even amongst that, if you were to trim this down and spruce it up like you see on Instagram with all these perfectly placed macroalgae, you've got a bubble effect from the Caulerpa racemosa, we've got like a seagrass effect from this one here, which is Caulerpa prolifera. We also have our friend here, Caulerpa taxifolia, which is almost like a seagrass, but then you have that frond effect. So aesthetically, Caulerpa can be great benefit to your display tank. Now, if you wanted to put some corals in here, you can see I have got some softies, then you can, but bringing us onto one of the negatives of Caulerpa is just how fast growing it can be. If you look at the back here, you can see what this Caulerpa is doing. It's spreading, and it's quite virulent in how much it can spread. And in this case, it is slightly overwhelming my corals and things on this rock. So you have to be vigilant with your trimming. You have to obviously be aware of how fast it can spread. And also, once it does have a foothold in your aquarium, you're probably not going to get rid of it because, as I've mentioned, it's only one singular cell. So even if a tiny little bit of root is left on the rock, that can regenerate an entire new colony of macroalgae. That being said, in my opinion, that isn't a bad thing. A lot of people think that this is the king of nutrient removal, but in fact I found that Cheeto is okay at nutrient removal. It's not the best in the world, but it's not the worst. The lot of reason why people use Cheeto is because it's actually quite easy to manage in the sump environment. In my opinion, the absolute king of nutrient removal is Alva. But coming in at my number 2 would be Caulerpa. Obviously there are lots of different species of Caulerpa, some of which are better for displays like Caulerpa prolifera, but then there are some species which I actually find to be amazing at your nutrient removal. And in particular it's actually this one. This is Caulerpa brachypus. Now this is one that you have to be reasonably careful with. So when you add this to your tank, it's best to make sure you're happy with it being there until the end of time, because it won't ever disappear and it will spread quite easily through fragmentation. That being said, because of how fast it grows, it is definitely my top 2 on nutrient removal. It is absolutely one of the best at soaking up excess nutrients, and one of the good things about Caulerpa brachypus is I've never had it go sexual, which is one of the things that a lot of people worry about when it comes to Caulerpas. Now brachypus, as I've said, never in my experience has gone sexual, which means all those nutrients that it soaks up do stay locked up in this macroalgae until you decide to dump some of it outside of your sump. So let's talk about that then. Macroalgae going sexual. What does it even mean? What is it? Are they starting to get amorous with each other? Well, sort of. From what I can understand of macroalgae doing this, is basically a reaction to something which they don't like, and it triggers them to try and reproduce with spores. And the list of things that can trigger this is basically endless. As soon as the Caulerpa feels threatened, it will go sexual. Now I've had it happen after water changes, so if you don't heat your water up to the right temperature, dump cold water in your tank, reduce that temperature down, it can trigger that reaction. I've also had it where it will go sexual because you've run out of a certain nutrient in your water, or maybe you've left your lights off for too long, or any number of environmental changes or deficits. But it's only when things change that can cause going sexual. I've never really found it to happen in systems which are really stable. So just like corals, it's really important to keep your macroalgae systems stable, or at least as stable as possible. The next part of that going sexual problem is a lot of people will then assume all those nutrients released into your aquarium are going to cause your system to crash with a ammonia spike overload. And again, that's something I've experienced to not happen. So I've had countless massive colonies of Caulerpa go sexual, and it does make your tank go cloudy, because obviously the insides of that macroalgae are now on the outside in your system water. But I've never had any sort of negative effects happen other than the cloudiness. The tank goes cloudy, but then 24 hours later everything seems fine. In my case, that might just be because I've got lots of extra macroalgae that suck up those nutrients really quickly, or it might just be it's another one of these fallacies that gets put online and everybody believes. But let me just tell you, I've never had any issues when my macroalgae goes sexual. Caulerpas tends to be one of the first macroalgae people buy, which is actually quite good because they're reasonably forgiving when it comes to new systems. You can put them into tanks which aren't mature. They do tend to get through that cycling process quite well, and they're also relatively easy to obtain and also pretty cheap to obtain. One thing you have to note, just like with any other macroalgae, is they are pretty tasty. So a lot of big tangs and angelfish are going to want to chomp down on this delicious treat. But that's why you are choosing specific fish like you would with any other macroalgae. Nothing that can chomp it apart, and it's a bit of a trial and error thing when it comes to fish. I've had things go into this tank which are supposedly reef safe. I put a Lamarck angel in here, one of the fish that you absolutely can add to a reef tank and not worry, but it took an absolute liking to this Caulerpa prolifera and was just taking chunks out of it. So yeah, it's a bit of a trial and error thing when it comes to what fish you add. So there we have it, Caulerpa, the almost perfect macroalgae. If you've enjoyed the video, please leave a like below and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Once again, thank you for watching and happy fish keeping.